Уважаемые дамы и господа, я хочу приветствовать вас на нашей конференции, цель которой является критически переосмыслить Октябрьскую революцию и революционный период и их ключевых фигур, идеи. Я хочу сначала благодарить в первую очередь нашей команды фонда Фридриха Эберта, именно Динара Калькюзи и Игмен, которые отвечают за логистики и организации. И без помощи и поддержки которых организация этого конференции не была возможна. Но я тоже хочу поблагодарить двум коллегам, именно Чарльз Бакстон, директор НПО «Интрак», и Георгий Мамедов, художественный руководитель НПО «Штаба», который были готов вложить их интеллектуальную мощность и опыт на разработку концепции этой конференции. Спасибо вам, Чарли и Георгий. Так, доклады первой части конференции стремятся на то, чтобы осветить вклад деятелей, которые способствовали продвижению и распространению революционных идей в Центральной Азии, а также главные интеллектуальные тренды XIX и начала XX веков. На самом деле мы хотим, и это будет именно во второй части конференции, обсудить вопрос связи между революционными идеями начала XX века и сегодняшними вызовами для гражданского общества. Может ли прогрессивный потенциал Октябрьской революции быть задействован гражданскими активистами и институтами гражданского общества в постсоветском Кыргызстане? И если да, то каким образом? Но до этого давайте посмотрим на вопрос, как вообще применить изучение о стране революции в Центральной Азии и как восстание 1916 года относится к советской революции, к Октябрьской революции. Этим вопросом посвящен основный доклад Игмена, профессор и доцент по центральноазиатской истории и директор программы по устной истории Калифорнийского государственного университета Лонг-Бич. Игмен, автор книги известного, разговаривал по-советски с акцентом «Культура и власть в Кыргызстане», и он тоже является автором других работ о революционном периоде в Центральной Азии. Я сразу передам слово Игмен.
Welcome. I wish I could present it in Kyrgyz or Russian, which are both quite, even though I studied those for many years now, they're both very rusty. So excuse me for presenting in English. But for the sake of clarification, I put some of the points up in the PowerPoint, so if you, it will be helpful to follow. But first, I'd like to thank the Andrea and Chinara and Dinara, but also obviously both Charles Buxton and Georgi Mamedov. So this is such an opportune moment for me because I work specifically, as Andrea pointed out, my first book was on houses of culture, Dom Kulturi or Medeniyet Yürü. Now I'm actually working on 4 actresses that were very dear to Kyrgyz populations. They are called Tükürdüş Tümtörkısı, 4 daughters of Tükürdüş, and I will talk about them briefly. But today's topic is really about the revolution, and my interest is to discuss scholarship on revolts and revolutions, Western scholarship mostly, and how we may see or examine both the revolts, Kazakh-Kyrgyz revolts, as Kyrgyz and Kazakhs call Ülkü, in 1916, and of course the revolutions that followed that period. So, let me begin. Some archival sources indicate that the Bolshevik Revolution did not reach some parts of Kyrgyzstan as rapidly as it did Tashkent or other major centers. I'm referring to the influence and practice of the revolution on the everyday lives, just pointed out, everyday lives of Kyrgyz populations. When the local Soviets initiated a new way of life in Kyrgyzstan, even the most ardent enthusiasts had some degree of difficulty applying the revolution to their communities. Although local revolutionary leaders established Lenin's corners, red yurts, or other gatherings in factories and other places to introduce Marxist-Leninist ideas to their populations, they had meager material support, as simple as pamphlets, books, posters, and others coming from the center. So when I looked at some of the archival materials here in Bishkek and also in Osh, I would see from 1920s on, many local administrators would write to the center. Center might be, Almaty or Tashkent or some other regional center, complaining that they didn't have enough materials to support the revolution. So, but when we think about Marxist-Leninist ideas at that time, of course, Lenin's idea of a vanguard communist party was essential, right? It was his sort of new way of looking at the ideology. So he needed to actually gather people to work as vanguard in the party to establish this new system. So I found many letters in the archives, and they continuously appealed, these people who are going to be vanguard individuals to support the revolution. They would write to the center for more support. These correspondences show that there was a respectable amount of support for the revolution in many corners of Kyrgyzstan, but there existed significant reticence, opposition, and sometimes animosity among some populations against outside influences. So this is an important point here. What they were against, were they against specifically the Russians, were they against the Bolsheviks, or simply were they against outsiders trying to initiate some change? So one might argue that it may have had an impact of 1916 Ülkü. It may have had, basically originated from the opposition to late imperial forces. So let me visit that shortly. The opposition to the imperial Russian administration among the Central Asian populations, no matter what the reasons were, according to scholars, resulted in massive numbers of casualties. All ethnicities suffered, large number of deaths, including the Russian settlers who were in the region. One scholar who studied before anybody else, at least in English, Edward Sokol, who wrote about the revolts as early as 1954. And he argued 270,000 people died during the revolt. And he also argued about 40% of the Kyrgyz population perished. So these numbers, of course, have been debated, discussed, and now, as you probably know, there are many conferences on this period, and some publications are coming out. So let's put this in a larger context. The 1916 revolt in Kyrgyzstan was neither an aberration nor unique, especially for the 20th century. When we place this experience in the global historical context of the last century, we may find many commonalities between this particular revolt and other revolts around the world. Let me start with the discussion on the scholarship of the definitions of revolts versus revolutions. I'm going to talk about some other scholars who don't necessarily study the particular October Revolution, but other revolutions. First of all, David A. Schaeffer, a historian of France, wrote in his book, The Paris Commune, I'm going to quote now, although riots and revolutions are both initiated by a problem, revolutions transcend the limitations of the immediate crisis, situating it instead as integral to the overall structure of society and as a contest for authority in the public space. Schaeffer argues that the French Revolution would have not succeeded without the enthusiastic and active support of Parisians. So, if I follow Schaeffer's lead, I investigate the nature of the 1916 uprisings in Kyrgyzstan and the rest of Central Asia, and I ask how one may measure successful support of rebels and revolutionaries that helped them turn an uprising into a revolution. So just to clarify that, how does a revolt become a revolution? What are the factors? So I ask, how do we understand this era of resistance and revolt that clashed with the Bolshevik Revolution from the point of view of established theories, and to analyze the revolts, rebellions, and revolutions in the 20th century? French Revolution and other revolutions are, of course, studied widely, as opposed to what happened in Kyrgyzstan. You know, we have very little, especially in English or other Western languages. So the most of the world are almost always unaware of what happened in this region in terms of revolutionary politics. So, in order to understand the revolutions, let me move into what I will argue, is that we cannot fully understand the 1916 revolt and later the 1917 revolution without a multidisciplinary approach. I'm trained as a historian, but I am now looking at other fields like political science, sociology, anthropology, to be able to understand what happened, not just from a historian's point of view, but from all points of view. So we need to consider theoretical approaches that go beyond those that focus on state versus society, or elite versus ordinary people. I think these are too simplistic to be able to understand what happened in this region. So there are some key components to studying revolts, including an engagement with theories of structuralism, state-oriented approaches, self-determination, opportunity, autonomy. These are important factors to be able to understand revolutions. And when we look at scholarship on revolts, we also need to look at cultural causes and cultural results of revolts and revolutions. And it is also important to study elite competition, how elites during any moments of revolution competed with each other to gain power. And also we have to obviously look at mass mobilization. If they were not able to mobilize the populations behind them, whether or not these revolutions would be successful. And equally important, we need to study demographics, we need to study race, we need to study class, and individual revolutionaries, individual people who participated and their characteristics. I don't like this word, the third world, but scholars use it, so the third world peculiarities. But we also need to look at gender. And today there will be a discussion, as I look at the program, specifically on female revolutionaries. So, basically my presentation is an invitation and a proposal to think within theoretical terms rather than comprehensive treatment of all theories to apply the revolution. One important figure, many of you who are from Kyrgyzstan will recognize Samira Ikmen here. I was lucky enough to interview her before she passed away in 2007. My work is on theater and individuals who participated in theater and film. During my interview with Samira Ikmen in 2002, I learned that she was a relative of Madame Mbek, a revolutionary leader who initiated a revolution in Margilan in present-day Uzbekistan in 1918 against the Bolsheviks. So this striking information made me think about what constituted a revolt as opposed to a revolution. And it sparked an interest in exploring what made a rebellion a revolution. Right now, there is because as you put this conference together, there's a great interest in terms of revisiting 1917. Two scholars who participated on Russian Revolution, rewriting of revolution in the West are one Steve A. Smith and the other one is Mark D. Steinberg. Steve's work is from 2002 and Steinberg's work just came out this year. I don't know if you have access to getting these materials, but they are important, especially for those of us who teach, especially Steve Schmitz's work is one of those small volumes that are considered, it's Oxford series, a very short introduction series from Oxford Press. What does he argue about the Russian Revolution? Those of when we are teaching classes on the revolution, we need to, if students never read this material, we need to actually summarize it in short terms and specify what was unique about the Russian Revolution. According to Smith, historians need to examine the lives and responses of ordinary people to be able to understand the Russian Revolution. He pointed out that Bolsheviks were firmly committed to an evolutionist view of social development. Let me repeat, evolutionist view of social development. He argues, therefore, that the revolution went hand in hand with an attack on, I'm putting in quotation marks as he did, backward aspects of Central Asian societies and cultures. So his argument is, with this very Marxist ideology of evolutionary politics, revolution in Central Asia also followed this trend. If you look at Mark Steinberg's work, which is this year's book, also published by Oxford, he analyzed the revolution as personal and emotional experiences. His argument is, we studied the Russian Revolution for too long as a structural political event. He argues that we now need to look at the revolution from the emotions, from the personal experiences. Otherwise, we will not be able to really put the Russian Revolution and the October Revolution in Central Asia in context. So, his book tells us about what he calls unmaking of empire, taking apart of empire. And he takes 3 individuals in his book, for us today, much more important than the others perhaps, Mahmud Hoca Behbudi, and he takes the Ukrainian individual Vladimir Vinichenko, and then of course Isaac Babev. So he takes 3 individuals and looks at their experiences from the point of view of the, how their lives were affected or how they affected the revolution. So, of course, his approach to Behbudi's life is most helpful in understanding the events of the transition from the empire to the Bolshevik era for Muslims of the empire. Steinberg reminds us that there were almost 14 million Muslims in the empire at the end of the century. Therefore, it is important to note the diversity among the populations and wealth of ideas in this population. He argues, this is an important point, maybe you will be debating this, he argues that Islam was invented as an ethnic and national category by the Bolsheviks. And basically he argues they didn't really invent it, but they followed ethnographers. They came before them in the empire, but they expanded on that. So, but he argues Muslim reformists like Behbudi and activists constructed this category for different reasons than the state. I argue Kyrgyz individuals too had their own reasons and methods to construct their own modern identity. I'm looking at one particular dissertation. She's one of my PhD students at the University of Washington. Now she teaches at Evergreen College in Oregon. Jipar Dushenbieva. She argues in her dissertation that İshanali Arabayev, Osman Ali Sıdıkov, or Belek Sultanayev, she argues, did not make a complete break from the tradition of the Akıns or Jomukchus who preceded them. What she's saying is, these revolutionaries tried to protect what is considered traditionally Kyrgyz ideas, but they also followed some of the new ideas. So she's talking about some kind of hybridity, respectfully, that these people, these important individuals follow. I argue the same when I discuss the 4 daughters of Tökürdeş in Turks. But I want to turn to the people who came before these revolutionaries, namely to the thinkers who became Arabayev, Sıdıkov Sultanayev, and others set the stage for change without abandoning their roots. You'll have to look at Jipar's dissertation if you want to get a little more information on that. But Kyrgyz Manasçıs, Akıns, or Jomokchus represented the main Kyrgyz thinkers of the late imperial era. You all know better than I do these names. And there I rely on the scholarship I list in the very bottom, as you see, Hasan Khan of Muhammedova's work. Influential Akins expressed the grievances of the Kyrgyz people in the Russian Empire in their writings, and they talked about the brutality of Russian military excursions under the Russian imperial hegemony. Kalıgül, for example, lamented the divisiveness of military conflicts between also two powerful tribes, Sarıbaliş and Lulu. So they are not only targeting the Russian imperial forces, but they're also looking at the divisiveness between the various tribes. And they promoted a message of unity among Kyrgyz against the foreign enemy. And Hasan Khan of Bekmuhamedova have argued that Kalıgül's early songs represented the Akhir Zaman or the Judgment Day poetry that blamed the ills of the society on modernity, but pointed out that Kalıgül eventually came to admit that modern education was the way of the future. You see what I mean by trying to accommodate both the traditional and the modern. I still have time, yes. So, forgive me, I will try to read in Kyrgyz Kalıgül's one of his poems here to sort of point to my argument. İlgerkini karasam, camanın cakşı tildegen, cakşısı ilim bilbegen, karanlık uşunday, arasında kavgul, yılagan közdün, caşınday. So, forgive my Kyrgyz, but I think what he's trying to say, if you look at the past, a noble man scolded a bad man, the noble man had no knowledge of science, there was such darkness, Kalıgül was among them, like a teardrop from the crying eye. So, his successors, the creator of Tar Zaman, the epic of irreparability, Arslanbek Buylaşoğlu, sang about the devastating consequences of the Russian migrants into Kyrgyz and Kazakh lands, and advocated the unified resistance of nomadic and Turkic people. These Akins strongly implied that to be Kyrgyz and Kazakh, one needed to resist Russian colonial control. Then you have, of course, important individual Moğol Kılıç, an influential Akin of the Tsar Zaman movement, who held views more similar to reformist elites. Reformist elites come in the later period, as you see, Togul of Moldova, and various other individuals who lived through the transition from the imperial to the Soviet period, began writing or singing about the hardship that Kyrgyz people suffered in the hands of the Manabs and Bais. Their songs targeted Russian Tsar, the Russian Tsar, the Muslim mullahs, and the so-called Kyrgyz aristocrats, more appropriately called the clan leaders. Skillful Akins such as Togul appealed to the Kyrgyz audiences with songs that skillfully juxtaposed love of the Kyrgyz people and the environment, respect for the environment, and injustices committed against both. So, as you all know Kyrgyz history better than I do, in the 20th century, Kyrgyz Togul's name has become synonymous with Akin, and his songs signify the Russian cultural revolution that followed the Bolshevik takeover. And I will not read his poetry to save you from my bad Kyrgyz reading. But Togul sang praises to those who valued hard work and diligence, but condemned those whom he called failures and freeloaders. He implied that Kyrgyzness needed to adopt certain, although selected aspects of Russian life. So here, I invite you to think about the influence of these aksakals on the young revolutionaries and successful leaders of revolts who converted to modernity. So, are we seeing these revolutionaries who challenged some of these ideas, or are those revolutionaries who actually came up with their own ways of seeing the future? So, let me go back quickly here. These are the scholars, the wrong one. These are the scholars whose work have been influential in the West studying revolts and revolutions. They look at many aspects of revolution. They look at various periods where revolutions took place. But I'd like to speak to one particular scholar's work. His name is Alexander Morrison. He's a British scholar who teaches now at in Nazarbayev University in Astana. He doesn't necessarily work on the revolution, but he looks at the imperial period, and he analyzes the construction of imperial citizenship in the late 19th and 20th century. He says that the Russian imperial approach to Central Asian populations on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution resembled some of the civilizing processes of the 19th century, such as the British and French revolutions colonialization in British Africa and Asia. So let me revisit what I messed up here. What he argues that Russian colonization in Central Asia had some similarities between French and British colonization elsewhere. But he points out there is a difference. Because Russian administrators were more concerned about religious incompatibilities, and they were fearful of cultural backsliding than what the British and French were worried about in Africa and Asia. In other words, Russian administrators treated the Muslim and Turkic populations in a special way. They did not necessarily see these populations as populations to be civilized. Their argument was all nationalities in late imperial period had to be brought up culturally, not specifically targeting several populations, such as the Muslims and the Turkic populations. So it's important to examine this from a point of view of the metropole versus colony relations that became an analytical theme. Another scholar, Daniel Brower, who analyzed the 1916 revolts, pointed out that Kyrgyz populations did not revolt only because of the Russian imperial policy of the military conscription, but they also had other reasons to revolt against the empire. He argues, just like Morrison, the Russian imperial policies did not target Central Asians because they wanted to civilize them, but instead they had to struggle with two main realities. One, they had to deal with the problems with settlers from Western and Siberian parts of Russia. He argues that there was a vacillating policy of controlling numbers and behaviors of the Russian settlers. That was the first target. And the second one was the forced changes to indigenous and local administrative patterns. For example, Kyrgyz Ayal administration and applying modern ideas to Kyrgyz Ayals. So, I still have some more time. So, to revisit so far what I said about these individuals, we need to think about, to return to my first introductory points, how do we study these things from a theoretical point of view? If we look at 2 or 3 figures, I won't repeat all these authors' names now, because you're not going to remember everybody's name, but studying uprising and revolutions really need to engage with theories of structures. First, we have to look at state-oriented approaches. They examine the struggle for self-determination, for opportunities, but also for autonomy. And the way in which we talk about rebellion really matters. What I mean is, language matters. How do we talk about those people whom we call rebels? How do we talk about those people who are going against the system? The way in which we talk about them really makes a, important contribution in terms of how we understand rebellions. The narrator, the person who tells what happened in a specific event in the past, their point of view is always subjective. As historians, we teach our students that we need to be objective about the past. My argument is it only depends on who's telling the story. So the ways in which one talks about the 1916 uprising, or we are talking about 1917 revolutions, are also subjective. Although the revolution or the definition and the analysis of the phenomenon of revolts are subjective, they are important. First, we look at the metropole-colony relations. I already pointed out Alexander Morrison's work and Daniel Brower's work, but also we need to talk about significance of community. This is probably most important for Central Asian response to Bolshevik revolution. Rebels and revolutionaries need to take risks, according to Roger Peterson. Rebels must sustain the rebellion against the powers of the regime. They need to take arms. They must have arms. They must have food. They must disseminate information quickly. They must have transportable resistance. What do I mean by transportable resistance? They need to actually convince the people who are participating in resistance that they have one goal. They must have an organization to hide from the authorities, because if they are caught, that's the end of the revolutionary movement. They also must recruit continuously to keep the revolution alive. So they need to influence people who are going to participate. And they also hunt down with those people who collaborate with the enemy. So we are also talking about quite a bit of violence, as every revolution requires, or at least results in violence. All of this is only possible if the rebels achieve community-based strength, meaning they actually have strong communities. How does that happen in Central Asia? This is probably a question we need to ask. A community must be economically homogeneous. It must be socially heterogeneous. It must be politically underdeveloped. And the community members who become rebels must be highly motivated individuals. They must have the respect of influential people. But of course, as the Bolshevik Revolution constantly reminded us, they must be able to agitate. They must be able to constantly move forward by agitating their populations. But not all societies with strong communities can sustain rebellion. One particular individual that will help us wrap all this up is Jack Goldstone's arguments. Weak state structures do not necessarily cause or sustain rebellions or revolutions. Structurally flawed regimes allow revolutionary movement, and it requires, he identified, 4 factors. Revolutionary leadership. Of course, there needs to be an ideology. Identification with revolution, which is important. We have to identify with revolution to be able to sustain it. And also international pressures that might influence it. And I added one more factor myself from Paul Brass's work, who worked on both India and also in Soviet Union. He talks about elite competition and elite conflict. So these are the theoretical approaches that may or may not be helpful for us to understand what happens in Central Asia. And, to basically conclude and how to try to connect my points to specifically to Kyrgyzstan, going back to this very individual figure that influenced my work, Sabira Kimishelieva and various other theater professionals in Central Asia. You probably will ask why these particular people. Because I think both the Bolsheviks and other modernists around the world used theater, later film, to advance their points of view. Theater always participated and helped with ideologies and dissemination of ideologies. Later, of course, film. As we see, Soviet theater and Soviet film have been highly influential. But in particular in Central Asia, with people like these Akins I talked about, but later, of course, people like Schmitz and other writers who started writing in the 50s and later, Soviet realism and various other genres, they also brought in the significance of gender, significance of women's role. And as a result, people like Kimishelieva and various others who were educated in schools like this. I found this in an archive here in Bishkek, in Osh actually. This is an Uçkur School of Tököldöş. As you see, there's one teacher in 1924 educating these young Kyrgyz pupils. Sadly, the photograph did not have any names other than her name. I don't know if these little girls and boys were, who they were, but hoping maybe that person looks very much like Sabira Kimishelieva, possibly that's her. But the 4 people whom you may be familiar with, Sayira Kizbayeva, Sabira Kimishelieva, Bakienka Tikeyeva, and Darka Pukova, those of you who may have seen films or plays or at least read about them. Why do I bring these people up? These people are very much the products of the Bolshevik Revolution. They were, when I interviewed Sabira Kimishelieva, she said, without the revolution, without these ideas, these modernist ideas, she said she would probably be a shepherdess. Now she's an actress who, is fluent, not only fluent in Russian, but she also upholds her Kyrgyz culture, how a Kyrgyz woman, a young woman, and a Kyrgyz, intellectuals should act. So they took on two roles. They took on one, showing the modernity of Muslim women who could become professionals, who could become theater individuals and influential figures. Two, they had to also be basically, they kept the tradition alive by playing in, plays that were written by Cengiz Aytmatov or others, playing certain roles like, various, like Igmen and various other plays. They sort of represented Kyrgyzness, but they also represented what meant to be modern for these individuals, because their gender had an important part, played an important part in these revolutions. Thank you for your attention, and I will stop here and hopefully we'll have questions about this. Thank you.